I'll sit down with you for this part.
We will begin shortly. We're being joined online by colleagues who are logging onto Zoom in 1 minute. We're just making a start in 1 minute when the event officially opens online. Lovely to see everyone back, and I can really hear the buzz in the room as well. So, you know, it's fantastic to see.
I'm sure the tech guys can fix that.
Yeah, exactly. Excellent. So,
Is it on the dot?
hello, and welcome to today's event. So this is a keynote speech, and as Helen, my colleague, mentioned earlier, we are exploring the theme of interdisciplinarity today. What is it, and why does it matter? And this keynote speech forms part of our summit, which is our annual network building event for the Digital Good Network. Welcome especially to colleagues who are joining us online. We really appreciate your participation in this talk. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A button during this talk. So, I'm delighted to be joined by Nancy Baym, who had the opportunity to meet earlier today for the first time. Nancy, you weren't here at that time, but when your name was mentioned this morning, there was a whoop, and a lot of people were really excited to, meet you. And I'll explain why, because Nancy has such an incredible biography. It's such a rich history of deep expertise in thinking about communication technology. Nancy is best known for co-founding the Association of Internet Researchers, and she served as its second president. And in a way, she co-founded internet research. So everything that we do is in large part due to Nancy and, of course, other researchers. So I think it's important to mention that because, of course, we are talking about interdisciplinarity today. And Nancy's currently partner research manager at Microsoft Research, and her research concerns social dynamics of new communication technologies. And before she joined Microsoft, she was a professor of communication studies at the University of Kansas. So she's written about Twitter, a biography, that's one of her books, and she's also written about Playing to the Crowd, which is a book about musicians, audiences, and the intimate work of connection, so incredibly interesting. And Nancy's achievements have been recognised with the Frederick Williams Prize for Contribution to Study of Communication Technology, which has been awarded by the International Communication Association. There's a book award that is named after Nancy, the Nancy Baym Book Award by the Association of Internet Researchers, and she has an honorary doctorate from the Faculty of IT at the University of Gothenburg. And so, you know, incredible track record, and it's just such a pleasure to be in conversation with you today. I really should introduce myself as well. I'm a chair. My name is Rima Patel. I'm a founder of the Ada Lovelace Institute. I'm on the management committee, as you all know, of the Digital Good Network. And I work as part of an organisation called Elgon Social Research, which specialises in including public voices in all sorts of policy issues and areas. So a really strong interest of mine is in AI. And just before we begin, some points of housekeeping. So the events will be recorded on Zoom and is being live streamed, as I've already mentioned, and a recording will be available shortly after our events. Zoom captions are available and instructions are given in the chat, but you do press the CC button if you can find it somewhere on the screen, and that's always very helpful. And Nancy will speak for as long as she would like to speak for.
Several days later.
But we have asked her to speak for anywhere between half an hour to 45 minutes. So it's completely up to you, Nancy, but that's sort of the steer we've given. And then there will be time for a bit of a dialogue between two of us, and then a question from the audience, both with us in person and also online. And Yes, just a quick reminder, we did ask about Q&A questions via Zoom. Just don't share the questions in the chat if you're on Zoom. So if you can, direct them to the Q&A box. And then also, my colleagues have asked if you could kindly tag us on LinkedIn, Instagram and Blue Sky. I won't sort of mention the aliases, but you can find that online if you like. So that's enough, I think, from housekeeping, and a reminder that this is about bridging discipline, academic and industry, and lessons from many years of trying. So over to you, Nancy.
Okay.
Fantastic to have you with us.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Hello, people of the internet. Thank you for being here also. Thanks for inviting me to do this. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Roz. And thank you, Ruth, for all you've done with your weekly emails to keep me on task. So it seems appropriate in this context here at the BBC. I'm now a researcher from industry. Most of you are in the academy. I have academic connections. It seems appropriate that I've been asked to talk about the challenges of doing research that bridge those kinds of boundaries between academia and industry, and the different fields of academia, and, as I'll say in a bit, the different fields of industry as well. So what I wanted to do is to draw really on my experience. So if you don't know my autobiography, and if that wasn't enough of a biography, you're going to know way too much about me soon, so stay tuned. My guess is that for some of you, this is going to be sort of old news. I'm giving voice to things that you probably know, and for some of you, it's probably going to be things that you're going to encounter eventually. So I hope that if nothing else, I can spark some ideas about bridge building as you go forward in your own work. So I wanted to start off by just laying out some kind of fundamental premises as I think about this. And I should say, interdisciplinarity is something that I live in all the time, and it's not something that I have previously been asked to develop coherent thoughts about. So I have lots of thoughts. I haven't read deeply in interdisciplinary studies. Some of you may have references I should have cited or whatnot. I'm really going to talk from personal experience, because that's what I know. But I've got a bit of personal experience. Dave? All righty. So premise number one, the really hard problems are socio-technical problems. They're not technical problems, and they're not social problems either. I think that we, in this room, probably have a little bit of a tendency to say, oh, the problems are social, right? You can't solve them with technology. I don't want to underestimate technology. Technology isn't going to solve the problems, but it's also going to be part of the solutions to the problems. So I work with computer scientists, and computer scientists, I learned, have a very specific definition of a hard problem. It's one of those things where it turns out there's specialized language in every way you could think of. So a hard problem in computation means there's not enough computational resources to solve it, right? It would take every computer on the planet more than a lifetime to be able to solve it. That's a hard problem. That said, when I talk to computer scientists and we talk about socio-technical problems, they go, oh, those are the real hard problems, right? So these are really, really hard problems. Technology amplifies all of the bad stuff. It amplifies the good stuff. It exacerbates problems. It's a resource that lets us fix them. And it's also can't be separated from the social, right? Technical and social are mutually constitutive at this point. We can't imagine a world without technology. We can't really imagine who we are without technology at this point, even if it's just like our classes, right? They're part of ourselves. So this means that the dynamics that we're thinking about in trying to address problems in pursuit of the good are incredibly complex. I mean, there's just no way out of it. Technology and sociality live together, hurt each other, help each other, play out in ways that we can't even begin to anticipate. Second point is that there is not a right answer. There are many right answers to socio-technical problems. This morning we heard a lot of nice examples of very particular contexts. And that's how it's going to be, right? So what works in one context is not necessarily going to work in another context. What works at one context at one time is not necessarily going to work in that same context at a different time. So they're very hard problems. There's lots and lots of answers to them, and we don't know necessarily which ones are the right ones. This means that we need a lot of different methods. We need a lot of different kinds of expertise. We need a lot of different kinds of experience if we're going to make headway on these things. So plea for interdisciplinarity there. Third point is that having been trained as a communication scholar, we were supposed to develop insight, right? Get us lots of insight, learn what's going on, spark ideas, and that's all wonderful, but if we're fixing problems, it's not enough to have insight, we have to get to impact. And insight and impact can be very, very different from one another. Somebody earlier was talking about the need to communicate with government, for example. If you go to government and you talk like you talk to academics, you don't get particularly far, right? You need multiple voices, you need multiple ways of interacting with people. So a lot of people have these kinds of expertise. So another reason that we need lots of people from lots of fields, because we're trying to influence lots of people to get the kinds of outcomes that we need to have. Okay. So I'm joining a very long line of people who've said that interdisciplinarity is important. And as I said, I'm not really an expert except through personal experience, which I don't want to diminish, but I want to just acknowledge that I'm not the first person to say interdisciplinarity matters. Gina Neff and my friend Annette Markham. My friend Gina Neff and my friend Annette Markham ran a workshop a couple of years ago on doing interdisciplinary work, and they argued that everyone benefits when research ecosystems integrate multiple perspectives. And I would agree, and as I gather from that workshop, it doesn't always end up being easy. So, like I say, what I would like to bring to this discussion is reflections on my own personal experiences working across disciplines in academia and also across different sectors in my own rather idiosyncratic career. So humor me while I take you through the life of Nancy. I will not start with a baby photo. But I will start in grad school. Actually, I'll go even further back. I will start at the University of Wisconsin, where I got an undergraduate degree in mass communication and journalism, and I was super interested in the question of how do people make sense of TV, right? How do they decide what to watch? What do they get out of it? Naive questions that undergraduates ask with tremendous enthusiasm. But then I went to graduate school at the University of Illinois, which you can see pictured here. I was in grad school for rather a while, as you can see. And it was to study interpersonal communication, which at that time was defined as how people form and maintain and dissolve personal relationships through face-to-face communication. Okay, face-to-face being key there. Like the telephone didn't even count in the textbook I was teaching from. So, you know, if you're in grad school, and you really know if you've been through grad school, that it's about becoming disciplined, right? We call them disciplines for a reason. It's because you learn to behave in appropriate ways for that field, right? So you're learning a branch of knowledge. You're learning the canon. You're learning particular methods. You're learning expertise in using those methods. You're learning ways of understanding the world through theory, right? You hang out with Foucault people, and they're like, oh, power. Discipline. You know what discipline means, don't you? Thanks, Foucault. You develop a lot of shared assumptions that anchor the way you see the world, right? So most of us in this room, for example, assume that the world runs on power, and that there was that nice comment this morning about, you know, ask how power is redistributed. Most of us will probably take power for granted. That's not true in a lot of other areas, right? And we don't even think about that we take power for granted, because we do. That's the point of taking things for granted. Right? So you learn a lot of language. You learn terminology, you learn jargon, you learn all that stuff. You learn criteria for what counts as high-quality research rather than low-quality research. You also learn how to situate yourself in your own discipline. So when I was an interpersonal communication scholar, I was not an organizational communication scholar. I was not an intercultural communication scholar. I was not any other kind of communication scholar. I was interpersonal. Right? Because your fields get so divided up, who teaches which courses and whatnot. Disciplines have a lot of wonderful things they offer, right? They offer administrators who help keep everything organized. They offer journals that you can get status for having published in. They offer conferences where you can come together and exchange ideas. So there's all these support structures that disciplines offer. But they also come with a lot of unspoken norms and codes of behavior, right? So if you remember or are now learning to write an academic article in your field, you learn that, no, you don't get to use your voice. You have to use the voice that we use in this journal, and it sounds like this. And maybe when you're really good at it, you can break voice and kind of do things your own way. But there's still going to be a lot of norms about who you have to cite or how you word things, or you say this instead of that to make the point. And if you don't do those things right, there's a lot of disciplining, right? There's punishment. You don't get published. You don't get accepted to conferences. You don't get a job. You don't get tenure. You don't get to keep your job, whatever systems are in place. So disciplines both provide support structure, and they also make you work within those support structures in order to receive the kinds of gains that academia may have to offer you. So all of this stuff you pick up in graduate school, some of it is explicit, a lot of it you're expected to just absorb. And if you've done a good job, and if your institution has done a good job, then by the time you get your PhD, you've forgotten all that stuff. You think it's just nature, right? Because you've taken it for granted, right? And you've forgotten that you actually have a lot of really deep expertise you worked really hard to achieve, and it distinguishes you from people in other fields. It's amazing how fast it is to forget that. Okay, so everything was going along great, right? I'm studying interpersonal communication. It's really fun. And then I found this internet. And this is what my computer looked like. I actually had a K-Pro PC that looked exactly like that. And you know, I ran the system in the top floppy, and then I had my files in the second floppy disk. And I was logging into the mainframe at the University of Illinois, and it was just this green bars stuff. It was really not sexy. And one thing led to another, and I find myself spending hours reading the soap opera discussion group on Usenet. And meanwhile, I'm in classes and I'm being taught face-to-face communication is how interpersonal communication works. And I go to the library to try and find some things about computer-mediated communication, and they say, oh, when you're online, you don't have any nonverbal cues, and as a result, you can't form any relationships, and sociality is going to be impossible. And you know, talk about low-hanging fruit, right? Like, actually, hello, career. So I found myself in this situation where I'm studying this phenomenon, and you have to remember, I finished my PhD in 1994. In 1994, it was less than 20% of the United States population used the internet at all, right? In 1996, it was up to almost 80%. So we were just about to hit a big boom, but we hadn't quite got there yet. So I was going to conferences and I was explaining, so imagine that there's computers and they're connected to each other. And you can send a message on one and it appears on another. And people were going, wow, this is really interesting. This is really important stuff. But it doesn't fit into our department because it's not interpersonal. It's not organizational. It's not mass comm. It's not journalism. It's not political. Really interesting stuff, but we don't know what to do with you. And I had a pretty crappy time on the job market initially as a consequence. My first article was published in the Journal of Folklore Research to give you an idea of who was welcoming my ideas. Because they were like, oh yeah, creating community through language, that's what we do, right? And I looked back at that article just out of curiosity when I was putting this together to see what I was citing, what disciplines I was citing in my first article in 1993. And the answer was I was citing media studies, literary studies, anthropology, ethnography of communication, and social psychology. So I had at least 5 disciplines that I was trying to bundle into my article in an interdisciplinary journal that was not in my field. So in retrospect, I think I was doing interdisciplinarity all by myself at that stage. Because that was the only way that I could really study the things that I was interested in. So then I went off, I became a communication studies professor. I spent 5 years at Wayne State University in downtown Detroit, and then I spent 13 years at the University of Kansas in Lawrence. Lots of great things about being a communication professor. I got a lot better at theory, I got a lot better at method, I learned a lot of things. I learned so much from PhD students in all those other different areas also. That said, I was kind of frustrated because so many things were happening outside of my home discipline that I knew were really important to the work that I was doing. So Rima has mentioned that I co-founded the Association of Internet Researchers. This happened in the late 1990s where a group of people, they had been at one conference and said, oh, we ought to do an internet thing. And then we went to, I think it was the National Communication Association, and had a little meetup of about a dozen people to go, well, what if we did a new thing? What would that be like? And we went home and Jeremy Hunsinger started a mailing list. We had 14 people on our AirL mailing list. And I was just itching. I was just itching because I knew there were people who were doing this stuff and I didn't know how to find them. It's hard to believe, but we didn't have Google back then. And we didn't have, we couldn't just go on to scholar.google.com and find out who was doing this work. We had to find it. So this is the statement that's on the website. Association of Internet Researchers is an academic association dedicated to the advancement of the cross-disciplinary field of internet studies. Blah, 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 independent from traditional disciplines and existing across academic borders. So from the get-go, the goal of the Association of Internet Researchers was, let's get out of disciplinary boxes and let's try to think across disciplines together. And as the person who planned that first conference, I had super high ambitions of, well, I had a mix. I had very high ambitions about the disciplines that we would be able to bring together, and I also had very modest ambitions about how many of them would show up. And it kind of went like this, in that a lot of people showed up, but they weren't from as many disciplines as I might have hoped, right? And as I became vice president for a while and then president, it was a really good early lesson in some of the challenges of interdisciplinarity. So you had people who were in fields that were not that different from one another saying, in my field we get half an hour to give a talk. And also, you shouldn't have so many simultaneous sessions, and the conference should only be 2 days. And you're like, what, 6 people are going to talk? That's not going to fly. We got into arguments or conflicts around things like, if you're in HCI or computer science, the conference is the publication, and some disciplines need to have a publication to get the funding to go to the conference. If you're in communication, a conference doesn't count. And if it's published that way, you can't publish it in a journal, and therefore you're harming yourself if you publish in advance. So you get those kinds of conflicts that are coming up between like English and communication, or communication and HCI. We're not talking about huge gaps. So there were a lot of issues around what kind of status markers people needed to get credit for participating, and what kinds of methods were most welcome. The super critical humanists thought that all that quantitative stuff that was empirical was boring and flat, and all the boring, flat, quantitative folks thought that all those critical humanistic people were out of their minds, and that wasn't even research, it was just anecdotes, and it was hard. It was hard. And I think that ultimately ESRC has succeeded in doing a lot of bridge building and community building. There are a lot of disciplines I would have loved to have involved who ended up finding other homes, right? Largely for these kinds of reasons. So in 2012, much to my surprise, I moved to Microsoft Research. If you don't know anything about Microsoft Research, it is the basic research wing of the organization. I don't think is anything really like it in big tech right now. There are a lot of, there's a lot of foundational research going on in big tech. It tends to be proprietary and used to feed into product. Microsoft Research, we have a mandate to engage the academy and to publish externally and to present at conferences. And if it happens to be useful to product groups or to other parts of the company, then we move it on over and figure out how that's going to work. But we call it curiosity-driven researchers, which is to say the researchers we're trusted to make our own decisions about what is most important to be studying right now. And the company trusts us to be wise in the decisions that we make. So we don't have to sit there and go, oh, what product group is going to use this, right? The product groups have a lot of researchers, stellar researchers of their own who are doing that applied work, and that's not our role. The lab I joined, Microsoft Research in New England, was founded specifically to be interdisciplinary. So the woman who created this lab, Jennifer Chase is her name. She's now the dean of computer science, data science, and something else at University of California, Berkeley. She had this vision, which was that biology and computation had transformed one another completely, because to deal with DNA data, you needed a lot more computational resources than existed. And what an incredibly interesting problem for computer science, right? So computer science reinvents itself because there's DNA data, and how are we going to deal with all of it? MIT literally put in more power stations because the computers didn't even have enough energy to be able to handle that kind of data. And meanwhile, biology, equipped with all these computational resources, could do all kinds of things that biology had never been able to do before. So these fields really became something different because of their intersection. And Jennifer's idea was, the same thing will happen if we put computer scientists and social scientists together. And you can see from here, this is from our website. We build on Microsoft's commitment to collaborate with the broader research community and pursue new interdisciplinary areas of research that bring together core computer scientists and social scientists. So interdisciplinarity really is key to the organizational identity of the lab, and it's why I went there, because I was like, yes, I can get away from all that disciplining that doesn't suit me. So when I first found myself in this environment, like most people who come to this environment, I felt really unqualified to be there, right? Because one of the things that happens when you've got your PhD, you're like, yeah, I know my field. And then you're walking around and everybody's like, oh, polynomial time. And you're like, I don't know what polynomial time means, right? People are saying things that you really, really do not understand at all. And yet you sort of have the illusion that everybody else understands everything everybody else is saying. So that was kind of good to get over. There were so many words I hadn't heard. So I felt really ignorant in many, many ways, because there was so much I didn't know, so much I didn't understand, so many conversations I couldn't even figure out what they were talking about. At the same time, there were fields like economics, for example, where I knew just enough to be completely wrong and think that I knew better than them, because I knew about society, and what were they studying if not social things? Well, you know, actually other things. So on the one hand, I was very aware of my ignorance, and on the other hand, I didn't let that stand in the way of judging other people for what I thought I understood better. I did get over both of those things, although I am still not quite sure what polynomial time is. I also learned how fully disciplined I had been. I said earlier that your disciplining becomes very invisible. You get in an environment like that and you discover all those things that you took for granted actually are things you learned, right? You worked hard to develop that stuff. And things like, for example, I discovered that if I said something like, you know, people co-create relationships through interaction, and everything they say reflects back on the relationship to date and projects forward to the next thing that's going to happen in this relationship. And computer scientists would say, ooh, this is very useful for thinking about error correction. Right? Suddenly your knowledge that you thought was like in some little corner over there turns out to be really interesting to other people, right? So a lot of joy in discovering the value of what I had come to take for granted. The flip side of that is that I think those of us social scientists working in that environment also got a whole lot smarter because we were constantly being exposed to all this stuff we didn't know. I remember going to, with Tarleton Gillespie early, and when people were starting to use the words machine learning, Tarleton and I went to Sham Kakade, who's now at Harvard, and said, hey, would you just give us a lesson? He's like, of course, of course. So I remember the three of us sitting there, and we're like, Sham, what is an algorithm? When you say algorithm, what are you talking about? Optimize, what is that? What is that? What do you mean optimize? What is machine learning? What even do these things mean? And I will not pretend to have understood them when I walked out of that room, but I will say that then I went to conferences for the next 2 years and heard people talking about, well, the Facebook algorithm does this. And I go, oh, no, that is not right. There's hundreds of algorithms that make Facebook work. Mark Zuckerberg can't sit there and code them to do this and that. That's not how algorithms work. And actually, we're all using algorithms all the time. I remember Christian Sandvig doing an algorithmic audit at ICA and saying, okay, raise your hand if you think these things are algorithms. And he started with a recipe in a cookbook. No hands. He's like, that's what they usually use in the introductory chapter of computer science textbooks to illustrate the example of an algorithm, right? So there's these little ways in which just being around all of these ideas gave us a lot more insight into how these systems we were critiquing actually functioned, which I think is undersold, right? It's really easy to sit back and critique, but if you're critiquing the Facebook algorithm to people who are aware of how algorithms work and how social media works, you sound kind of not worth taking all that seriously from the point of view of folks who understand the computation, because you're missing some really basic stuff about how technology actually functions. I also became very aware of more things that stand in the way of disciplinarity by being in this environment that's built on the premise of let's do interdisciplinarity. Everybody who joins that lab comes, like me, because we're excited about the possibility of being in conversation with other disciplines all the time. And both in terms of with the company and also in terms of the other fields in the lab and also in terms of the visitors and the academy at large. But we run into all these different kinds of problems. So I've already mentioned language, I've mentioned what counts as a publication. There's also things like how many authors should there be on a publication, right? Some fields, if it happened in somebody's lab, they go on there, whether they had anything to do with it or not. Some fields, if you walk by the door and say, oh, hi, you're an author. Others, if you didn't sit there and write those paragraphs, you're not an author, right? Those are pretty hard to negotiate. If there's multiple authors, what order do they go in? Is the first author the most important person? Is it autobiographical? Is it, alphabetical? Does the primary author go last? I mean, these are, talk about unspoken norms, right? But these are crucial to getting the kind of credit that we need. So if you're in a discipline where first author is most important, and they're in a discipline where last author is most important, what order are you going to put yourselves in? You better get clear on that right away. And in a sense, those are the easy things, right? What counts as being productive varies so much from discipline to discipline. Computer scientists publish absurd amounts of articles every year because they're all multiply authored. Economists, if they publish one every couple of years, they're doing great, but they look like textbooks, every econ article. They're like 80 pages, you know, they're like theses. And then you get into these really deeper problems. Do you think about research as I'm trying to solve a problem? Right, this is language we hear a lot at Microsoft. What problem are you trying to solve? And we're like, I'm a critic, man. I'm analyzing phenomena. I wish I could solve racism. I don't think my work is going to do it, you know? I've said that so many times. You know, I want to solve it. I don't think we can. So what is the point of research in the first place? Are you trying to solve problems? Are you trying to offer insights? Is it critique? What are you doing here? What is a good research question? What's a good problem? I hear people in fields like math and computer science evaluating one another, go, oh, she has such good taste in problems, right? In my field, we didn't talk about taste in problems, but I can think about it and go, yeah, some people have better taste than others in problems, in fact. So what's a good question? What's a good answer to that question? What's a satisfactory answer? What do you think knowledge is? How do you think you get to knowledge? Suddenly you're like, whoa, we have completely different assumptions about how the world works and what knowledge is and how you get there. And that's a much deeper issue then what order does our authorship go? If we don't actually agree on the basic terms of epistemology, right? But I found myself with my colleagues, we don't actually agree on some very basic terms of epistemology. So almost all of these questions, all of these that I've posed, we have answers to, right? You have an answer, you have an answer, you have an answer. You probably, if I say, okay, what do you think knowledge is? You probably can't articulate it because it's part of that tacit training that you bought into along the way. And that's true of everybody in all kinds of fields, which means that we're not very well equipped to have those conversations about, so tell me about your epistemological orientation, right? Instead we're like, ooh, this is a cool problem, let's work on it together, right? Or, ooh, that's a cool question, and you know how to do this thing. And that's fine, but it's not gonna get us as far as we need to go because we do run into these really, really deep barriers. So unless you can sort of surface and unearth these things, it gets very hard to articulate them. So you gotta kind of unearth your disciplinary training and recognize that there's a lot of beauty in it, right? It's not something to be set aside for interdisciplinary work. It's where your strength is, right? And I think we lose sense of what is my strength because we're comparing ourselves to others in our field. And when we compare to other fields, then we become much more aware of, oh, I understand the co-construction of reality through communication. Go me, right? This became even more apparent to me as I began collaborating across the company. In preparation for this talk, I went and I had a look at the careers.microsoft.com website where we list all the jobs, and you can, do your drop-down menu, and one of the drop-down menus is discipline. So you can search by discipline. And I tried counting how many disciplines there are at Microsoft, and I got bored when I got to about 120, and the list was still going on, literally. So it's not just that there's so many disciplines in the academy, there's so many disciplines within any industrial organization as well. So I put these particular slides up because one of the most visible interdisciplinary efforts across Microsoft has been this New Future of Work initiative that has resulted in these annual New Future of Work reports, where we pull together like 50 or 60 people across the company and try to synthesize all of the research that's coming out about, at this point, AI and work. It was remote work when we started. And it made it really clear both the value of putting this much brain power together to think about big issues from different perspectives, and also, again, the challenges, right? Because I'm in Microsoft Research, that means my job is to further knowledge. That's my primary mission, is to push the boundaries of the state of the field, advance the state of the field. If you're in applied research, that's not your job. If you're in applied research, your job is to anticipate and mitigate harms and great things that could happen with products. Seize those opportunities, invent them. If you're in marketing, and we have great marketing researchers, but their job is to create a positive public perception, right? You can imagine how that might conflict with critical theorists. Yet we find our way. And then, of course, you got user experience researchers, and I'm just talking about researchers, right, within Microsoft. And the user experience researchers, their job, of course, is to provide a rewarding experience in using whatever it is that you're using. So even amongst the researchers, you have these really different accountabilities within the organization. And at the same time, like our lab, and to an extent like AIR, it demonstrated how, if you've got a shared sense of mission, a shared sense of purpose, a reason for working together, you can work through these things and create things that maybe you're not, like, I don't love every slide in this deck, I'll be clear, right? But I respect its right to be there. And I think that's really important, is that you have to develop a certain amount of tolerance, so they see it differently, and that's okay. I'm not gonna get on my high horse and tell them that it shouldn't be like that. So through all of these experiences, we now come to the cat portion of this presentation. Through all of these experiences, I would say that I have developed a bit of a sense of what kind of mindset characterizes really good interdisciplinary scholars, and also what kind of environments promote them. So let me start with a few points about mindset. Please stay alive. Curiosity, right? People who are good at interdisciplinarity want to encounter ideas that shake up the way they think. They want to feel that feeling of ignorance. They want to feel like, wow, I don't know anything about that, tell me more. They want to know that maybe the way they've been thinking about it could be rethought, right? That's hard. That's hard, to be willing to remain very curious about things about which you know very little. Good interdisciplinary scholars have a willingness to meet other people where they are. And this is, I think, very, very hard, because especially like if you're dealing with, to make a crude overstatement, right? I think many people who work at tech organizations are technological solutionists. They're there because they want to make the world better and they believe technology is the way to do it. And they are not going to respond well if you come in and you go, well, actually, it's all co-constructed and it's socio-technical and you can't do that. Technology doesn't fix it. The problems are really social. Then they're like, fine, so I should just quit? Never mind, I'm going to go talk to these people over there who respect what I do. Right? You have to meet people along the way and bring them along. And they will come along often if you get there. But you do have to recognize what are the things that people are getting rewarded for? What are the pressures that those people are under? What are their accountabilities? How are they disciplined? And work with that, because if you try to bring them into your discipline and make them into you, they're going to shut down, and rightly so. The other side of this, of course, is that you learn an awful lot when you meet people where they are, because they'll teach you about what they know. And the third piece of this is humility. And when I talk about this, I mean, you have to be willing to accept the idea that you might be wrong, that somebody else's idea might be better than your idea, that some field may actually have methodological tools that are better than your own field's methodological tools for this particular problem. In some cases, you have to be willing to let other people get the credit for work that you've done together, because it gets you to where you believe the world needs to be. And sometimes that means the product group has to get the credit, because the researcher doesn't need it, and the product group needs it. And that's okay, right? You don't need your name on every publication. Obviously, career stage is going to have a lot to do with your capacity to do this. But as a mindset, if you're thinking, I better get all the credit, and I've got to make sure my name is on there, and I got to make sure it's done my way, you're a bad interdisciplinarian. So those are individual things, but I am not an individualist enough to think that that would even begin to fix the challenges of interdisciplinarity. You really do need structures that can support this. And our lab is a really nice example of that. So I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about how do you build for interdisciplinarity to happen. Right off the bat, I want to say it has to be top-down. Right? The thing about our lab was that it was our job to be open to interdisciplinarity. It was our job to bridge disciplines. And it was not our job to publish in the top journal in our field, speaking only to our people. Right? If we want to do that, go be in a university department. You know, there's great places to do that kind of work. That's not our job. So in the case of Microsoft writ large, when we do our merit evaluations, the concept is impact. Have you had impact, right? Boy, did I find that hard as a scholar, right? Impact? I don't know. What does that even mean, right? But it's a reframing that allows you to say, you know, hey, I went to a computer science conference and I talked to computer scientists. I had impact on that field. And like, ooh, neat, right? So it's a small change of framing, but when you get out of how many articles did you publish and were they in the right venues, and you can switch the mindset to who are you trying to influence? Who are you trying to have an effect on? And what kind of effect are you seeking to have? And can you demonstrate that you had that effect? It really opens up that box of disciplinarity and allows people to be rewarded for doing different kinds of work that doesn't necessarily fit neatly into their field. And that has to come from above. But you also need opportunities in daily life to be able to engage other disciplines. So let me give you some really concrete examples. We were super lucky in that when our lab in Cambridge, Massachusetts was formed, it didn't exist yet. And so they had to like get a space, right? They rented a floor of an office building, and it was a completely empty floor, and they had to literally build a space for interdisciplinarity. So this is my office, or looking out of my office, and I show it to make a few points. One is that the walls are glass, right? That means if I'm sitting there, if my colleagues are sitting there, everybody's visible. We have privacy, but we're visible. And that means if people are walking by and they see me there, they go, "Do you have a minute?" And I go, "Yeah, sure, come on in." And we chat. And this, I'll give you just one example. I had a colleague, Adam Kalai, who now works in safety at OpenAI. Adam had the office next to mine. He started getting interested, we're talking like 2013 maybe, he started getting interested in, oh, maybe algorithms are biased. And what he meant by bias was they tilt this way or that, not necessarily it's good or bad or it's prejudicial, just they tilt this way or that. But then he was starting to notice, and others were starting to notice, like, what if like a site like LinkedIn is delivering one kind of job ads to women and another kind of job ads to men? That's bad. We can't have that. And then he'd come into my office and he'd say things like, "Nancy, what is gender?" Or he'd come into my office and he'd go, "Okay, Nancy, help me with this one. If an algorithm says that a nurse is a woman, that's bad. But if an algorithm says that a wife is a woman, that's okay. How do I think about that?" How do you think about that computationally, right? It's actually kind of a really hard question. Adam and I also had a lot of talks about humor. And at the time, he felt very strongly that the holy grail of computing, the unachievable holy grail, was can a computer be funny? And as a result, we ended up doing a couple of papers together about computationally assisted humor. Super fun. But when LLMs broke, and all my colleagues in the academy, all my critical people were going, "Oh, AI hype, this is nothing. Oh, we've heard this all before." I was going, that computer is funny. That's the holy grail. They did a really big thing here. This is a much more massive breakthrough than my peers are giving credit for, right? Whether you think it's going to do this or do that is beside the point. The point is that they actually achieved a remarkable scientific breakthrough here that they weren't sure was going to be possible in their lifetimes. And that's kind of a big deal, right? So again, kind of like the Facebook algorithm, when you're like dismissing AI as all hype. No, actually something really important happened there. What becomes of it is to be determined, right? But there was in fact a very significant scientific breakthrough that happened. And I would not have been able to appreciate that if I hadn't been in a lab where I was primed to understand the limits of computing in a way that let me see how they had been overcome. In some ways, certainly not always. You can also see my books in the hall out there, my books, my color-coded books. This means when visitors and other folks are in the lab, they're walking around and they see this colorful bookshelf and they go, "Ooh, ooh." Mary Gray and Tarleton Gillespie also have walls of books because we're the only ones who have books. Everybody else does articles. We have so many books. Everybody's so impressed. But this means that people wander by and they look at it and they go, "Oh my gosh, people study that? I had no idea there was a field that studied that." I've converted a few interns from other disciplines because of that bookshelf. And through that door, you can also see what we call the tea lounge, now the chaise lounge. And in that room, we do a lot of things that demonstrate the practice of interdisciplinarity. So we have a weekly all-hands lunch, which you can see in the center there. We eat together, we break bread together, we sit together, we talk across disciplines, and then we wrap up with a 15-minute whiteboard talk, which means that every week we're sitting and listening to a talk that's probably not in our own discipline for 15 minutes, right? Week after week after week after week. It adds up. We also have something that we call the jargon jar. This is AI's version of a jargon jar, which I find incredibly entertaining. It's got some really, like, it got agency right, but then it's like platoforce. if you hear a phrase, you don't know what it means, you can write it. You write it on the whiteboard, or you put it in our online jargon jar, and then boom, once every few weeks we pull one out and we discuss it. And it might be a very computational term. Last week I had to explain dialectic. Super interesting, super fun. So we just get exposed. This is all really low-key exposure, low-cost exposure, low investment exposure, but it builds, it accretes, right? We also have weekly colloquia in disciplines that we're not in, which tend to, it used to be that coming in I would understand maybe like the first 3 minutes, and then I got up to 5 minutes, and then I got up to 20. I was really proud of myself, and now I can even make it into some of the formulas and not get lost. So we sometimes compare how long we've been there by how far we can make it into the colloquia before we don't understand anything anymore. Again, the humility of being able to sit through talk after talk after talk where you know nothing and trying, even though you're not necessarily succeeding. So all of this does not, oh well, let me give us a couple more things. I'm running out of time, but I want to say a few more things. We also do make intentional efforts to surface commonalities. This is a whiteboard following a off-site that we did where I posed the question, if you had a magic wand and could make the world magically conform to the goals and values that drive your work, how would the world be better? Give us a word or a phrase that could illustrate that. And we came up with things like tech does the stuff that isn't fun, the climate is improved, each person can have the customizable interface that's appropriate for them, people have increased capacities, people are resilient, people have meaningful jobs. Basically, we came out with the digital good, right? Even though we had actually seeded ourselves based on optimism or pessimism to make sure we had mixed tables of optimists and pessimists. And so those are things where, do we immediately go start working together on improving the climate? Not necessarily, but now we know that we share that goal. Right? All of these things take so much time, and I think that's what's missing in a lot of interdisciplinary efforts, right? All of this means that for literally years, we're sitting there baking in each other's, marinating in each other's expertise, right? And so by the time we get to a place where we might ask a question like, oh, like my colleague Mary Gray, working with computational biologists, thinking about data, right? And what kind of data needs to be in place for patients to be willing to share their health data for future research, right? Great question, really hard question, not just a communication question, right? You need people in that mix who are working with health professionals, who are working with computing, who are working with people. So in my last couple minutes, I want to think a little bit about what does this mean for collaborating and critiquing with big tech. In the same way that academia has got so many different disciplines under so many different pressures, so too does industry, so too do industry partners. And if you're going to collaborate effectively with industry, you got to figure out what is this person's role and what are these people getting rewarded and punished for. Which sounds kind of obvious, but I think often people approach it and they're like, yeah, I'm working with Google. Right, as though everybody at Google has the same motivations, the same jobs, the same roles. Actually, no. People at Google have very different accountabilities depending what part of Google they're in and what their role is, if I might speak for Google. So it is super important to understand how is this collaboration going to benefit them, given their goals and their needs in their situation. And again, humility, willingness to let other people take some credit is super important there. There's a lot of work I've done that will never end up in publications, but which built the relationships that got me to the point where I had the trust to be able to do research that could result in publications. And in terms of critiquing big tech, as many of us do, even within tech, I think that often when I go to conferences, I often hear some rather simplistic critiques of big tech, like, capitalism, they're all motivated by the profit motive. Well, of course, duh. Tell me you don't want to make money? But that doesn't even begin to explain what's going on inside of industry, right? There are so many people in industry who have so many different perspectives, who are jockeying for resources, who are arguing with one another, trying to persuade. You have allies in industry, you have allies outside industry. You got people in industry who you don't like and you don't want them advancing in your organization. You want your people to advance in your organization. So I think you need to understand that both within an organization, there are so many different roles with so many different accountabilities, so many different points of view, and they may be in conflict with one another. So even if you're writing about one company, you're writing about a really messy realm of stuff that doesn't collapse easily into the villain that you're portraying. And then if you're saying stuff like, oh, well, the FANG companies, as though those companies are the same, right? I mean, these are very, very different companies, these different companies that get collapsed into big tech. So when I hear these critiques of big tech in academia, sometimes it kind of breaks my heart, because a lot of times there's really valid critiques being made, and they're often being made from a place of such an oversimplified caricature of industry that I know it will never have any impact. You know, you're talking to each other and you're making each other feel good about how critical you are. And that's really lovely, but it's not going to have any impact, right? So I think it's really important, if we're going to be studying industry and if we're going to be critiquing industry, and I'm going to be at the front of the line saying critique the tech industry. As a person who works for Microsoft, I can say that a lot of people within big tech welcome critique. We're hungry for critique. We want to hear those critiques. But it does mean that we have to understand organizations and how organizations work. And just like you would never say, everybody at this university is like that because the academy values this, you'd go, those people in that department, they're totally different from me. The same thing is going on in industry, right? So you really need to have some organizational expertise, some media industries expertise, some kind of expertise that allows you to think critically about what are these organizations I'm critiquing? They're not flat comic book villains, despite some people. Okay. So, last thought, and then I'll shut up, is that if we're going to build bridges, this is my summary, if we're going to build bridges, as these cats are doing, we got to be aware of how we've been disciplined and how others have been disciplined. We need a mindset that's clear on the strengths we bring from our own discipline and the happenstance of the particular demands our discipline makes on us. We have to respect that other disciplines and sectors have strengths that we lack and they're under pressures that we aren't. We need to be curious and willing to contribute to others' advancement, even when it might mean compromising on how we would have done it if we'd done it ourselves. And we can't put this all on individuals in small groups. We have to build environments where there's support from the top so that the incentive structures reward interdisciplinarity, and so that we have the opportunities to build spaces where people can take the time and engage in the ritualized, mundane, and special practices that let people learn each other's expertise, learn how to talk about their own work with different audiences, build personal relationships, and find the common values and goals that can drive successful collaboration. The Digital Good Network is a formation through which this work is already happening, and I hope that these comments have prompted some ideas that might strengthen it. So, thank you.
Amazing. Thank you.
We'll leave the AI cats.
Fantastic. Incredible talk. One of the things that I love about cats, I should say, is...
They look so good in
I mean,
hats.
these cats are lovely, of course. They're all lovely. One of the things I love about cats is their ability to adapt and respond to the environment. They're very street smart animals that I've observed. And you know, this kind of, let's work with the metaphor of a cat, but that's something really interesting about interdisciplinarity, isn't it? The ability to recognise and identify patterns and changes in the environment. And we've seen such change in such a short period of time with technology. So I think there's something really interesting about the role that interdisciplinarity plays specifically in relation to technology, where you have that rapid, volatile change. That's just one reflection amongst many on the talk. I wanted actually to ask you to say a little bit more about why you set up the association. What was it? What made you think at the time?
Why did we need AIR?
Yeah.
I mean, it was really simple. It was that I knew that there were people in other disciplines and other countries who were doing relevant work, and I didn't know how to find them.
Yeah.
And other people had that sensation too. Plus, we felt very marginalized in our own discipline. Like my first conference paper about the soap opera news group, I was put on a panel called New Directions in Communication Research, and it was for absolutely unrelated papers, right? They were fine, but it was random, totally random. And I was like, I know there's people who are thinking about these things, and I don't know how to find them. I'll throw a conference and everybody will come. And that's kind of what happened, you know? So it was really, I mean, if it were today, I don't know that there would be the felt need to start an association, because we would have been able to find each other's research and cite it anyhow. But we really couldn't find each other. And it was funny, because when we wrote the call for the conference, I remember at the time being like, oh, this really nails it. And then we put it out in the world and people came, and I was like, wow, we really captured the moment. And then a few years ago, I went back and I read the call, and it was like, there's nothing there, right? It was just that people were that hungry that we dropped one little breadcrumb and they're like, oh, a feast, let's go. People came from like 15, 20 countries to Lawrence, Kansas. You know, they'd never even heard of Kansas, and they showed up. Were you there, Gina? You might have been, you weren't there. No, so probably a few people around who were there. So anyways, yeah, that was the motivation, was just to find each other, because I knew they were out there.
Exactly. And you, presumably you thought it would be important to find each other.
I wasn't thinking that far ahead. I
No,
was
you
just
weren't.
selfish.
Okay.
I was just selfish. I just wanted to know what they were thinking about.
Okay, that's interesting. And a slightly more challenging question, but you know, you've received a list from me, so it's all fine. Just a slightly more challenging question, which is about, you know, how we know interdisciplinarity works. How do we know it works? Does it work? Does it improve outcomes? What's your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's kind of like, what is good? What counts as what works? I think there's areas in which clearly innovation and change has happened because different disciplines informed one another. So if I think about this context, for example, if we think about responsible AI as a field and all these questions about how do we ensure that AI is not exacerbating divides, but is treating everybody with equity and all of these values that have been discussed today. If we believe that AI should be fair, if we believe that AI should not be racist, should not be sexist, should not be xenophobic, if we believe that all of those things, then we have to be able to articulate it. And when I see the people doing that work, it's places where computer scientists and social scientists have been in discussion for long enough that somebody can learn enough about gender theory that they can go write something in code that might, or be able to envision how you would do it in code. If I think about work right now around LLMs, there's so many questions about cultural representation, some of which have been raised today. Well, boy, it sure helps when there's some linguists around with those computer scientists if you want to talk about things like, as my colleague Kalika Bali in our Bangalore lab does, can an LLM think in Hindi, right? No, it can speak Hindi, but it does it in American, right? It says, have a piece of key lime pie, which, you know, doesn't work in Hindi. Yeah.
And yeah, that's an interesting question. Can I ask you one last? I will ask you one last question, then I'll open to the floor. It'll be really interesting. We've got plenty of time for questions, by the way. So just heads up, if you've got questions, do you think about how you're going to frame and say them? When I was reading and listening to your talk, I was really struck by a book that I read by David Epstein called Range. And in this book, there's a really interesting analysis that he gives of the ways in which, in the long term, in the long run, people who have a sampling period tend, in the long run, to outperform people who don't. So in the short run, you see that especially you know, start their career trajectories off really early. You see that especially with the sort of qualified profession. But he also finds that there's a group of people who just do a bit of everything. And you find that that those people identify what works best for them and they develop match fit for their role. That's what he calls it. He uses the example of someone like Roger Federer, who exhibits these qualities. He played a wide range of sports before he then became who he was. And many other examples and anecdotes in this book. And he also draws on studies as well. And when I was listening to you, I was really struck by this this finding, and I was reminded by some of this work, because the idea that we have range is actually not is not the narrative. That he's really pushing back against the sort of 10,000 rule narrative. And so we have a system and we have a structure that really rewards people for doing exactly that, performing in the short term rather than the long term, the long run. We have systems and structures that mean that people really want to be named as sole authors or as you mentioned, have their own credit, and funding systems also that reward individuals very much for their work and overlook the contribution of collaborative and collective. So it seems to me that if we really truly value interdisciplinarity, we need to quite fundamentally shift our structures and our systems so that you know, that change happens, and so that we can see some of the benefits that Epstein was talking about. And what's your take on all of this?
Well, Federer did become a tennis player,
yeah.
right? He didn't become a generic ball player because he had wide range,
yes.
right? He sampled these things and then he specialized. And I do think that, yeah, I do think being exposed to a lot of different disciplines is really important. I also don't want to undervalue the strength of being deep in your own discipline. Right?
Yeah.
And interdisciplinary isn't for everybody, and that's okay, right? I mean, what makes somebody a valuable contributor to a project, an interdisciplinary project, is usually not that they know a little bit of a whole lot of different fields. It's that they know theirs really well and they know how to work with yours, right? So I think we need, for interdisciplinarity, I think we need the range of understanding, the breadth of ways of approaching work that there are out there, that long list of questions that ends with, you know, what is knowledge? I mean, we need the breadth to realize, oh, an economist is not trying to describe reality exactly. They're not trying to display all the messiness. That's not their job. Their job is a beautiful mathematical model. And if it accounts for 75% of what's going on, maybe I'm more interested in the other 25%, but I know now that they've got a beautiful model of that 75%, and I can't take that away from them, right? So that kind of breadth of just, okay, I get what those folks are up to, and I see how it's different from my own. And I think that makes you better at yourself too, because if you say, oh, like that, that's actually an example from a talk where an ML person, this was quite some time ago, was giving a colloquium about how they had been able to develop algorithms that could look at the ratings of products on one site and predict with, I think, 78% accuracy what they would be elsewhere on other sites. And so it was a cool finding, right? They had an algorithm 78% accounted for. And of course, my mind was immediately like, what's happening in those other 22%? That's where the interesting stuff is. That's where the future lies. And yet at the same time, I had to go, oh, okay, 78%, that's pretty good, man. They did a good job. There was one case where, oh my gosh, this economist gave a talk about how marriage patterns changed in Sweden when the inheritance laws changed. It used to be that women got a government subsidy if they were widowed, but men didn't, and they changed it to make it equal. And this, so that if a man was widowed, he also got this pension. And she went and she looked at all of the data of marriages, which are all logged in Sweden, and she showed these really concrete changes in who married whom. I study interpersonal communication, right? So she had this formula to explain marriage, and there was a theta that modified everything within the parentheses, and I'm like, that theta is my whole discipline, right? These are strengths and weaknesses, right? Breadth is good, but you do have to kind of use it to understand yourself as well and what you contribute, because I think you really do have to get pretty sharp about what do I know and what is, how does that contribute. I think often when we end up in these interdisciplinary environments, you feel dumb, right? You feel like, I don't understand that stuff, right? They're smart and I'm not. So it's very helpful to realize, oh, I'm smart in these ways and they're smart in those ways, and together we're super smart. That's breadth. That's my take on breadth.
Yes. And actually, Epstein writes about the specialised generalist, which I think was really interesting.
Oh.
The generalised specialist. That's quite an interesting book. I recommend anyone. Well, I mean, there are many books, but it's an engaging and interesting book. I think I'm conscious about questions, and so I was hoping I might take some from the room in one round, and then another from online. Should we go in that order? Would colleagues have any questions for Nancy? Loads. Great. So I'll start.
Yes, no, maybe.
I'll start here and then we'll move there. And we'll take them together, shall we? Yeah,
Sure.
let's do that. And it's a question.
Hi, Nancy. I'm Genevieve Brown. I'm at the University of Northumbria. And I just wanted to say I love your work. I've been reading your work since I was in my master's, so it's such a great honor to get to see you speak today. I wanted to know, just out of curiosity, because I'm very curiosity-driven, what's your favorite interdisciplinary project that you've ever worked on, like the most fun or most innovative, or just your favorite?
Okay.
Favourite project?
Favorite project?
Yeah, thanks for the great talk. So I'm a professor in computer science, and I would love to hear more of your thoughts on interdisciplinary work in academia, in particular for young scholars. I mean, would you recommend, following up on the range issue, that they first really go deep in their domain and sort of only engage with sort of interdisciplinary things in more depth sort of later sort of or so? Or is it advisable to sort of to do interdisciplinary work from the beginning and not really have a home discipline or sort of so? Because at least in my own group, I typically advise my PhD students, right, first build your reputation in your domain and then sort of branch out later in a sense.
Yeah.
And I think we had one more question, didn't we? Over there. We have one more question.
Hi, I'm Becky Faith, and I wondered, taking your kind of talking about impact, any advice for those of us working with government or in government, talking about these hard socio-technical problems and how to compress them into 3 bullet points?
Okay. Thank you. Do you want to take Amy's question too?
Yeah, let's. I think that
Work
3
with
key
those 3?
questions.
Okay. My favorite interdisciplinary project, the humor stuff, was so fun. It was so fun. And we published papers with titles like, OMG, you are so funny. And cockamamie gobbledygook for nincompoops. I mean, come on. Who doesn't love a project that results in cockamamie gobbledygook for nincompoops? Which demonstrated that ML could figure out which words were funny. That was just a really fun project. And I learned so much. I learned so much through doing it. And my colleague also learned so much. He's a computer scientist. He was interviewing comedians about humor. Like, how great is that, right? That was super fun. That was a super fun project. The New Future of Work has also been incredibly rewarding. The exposure to different ways of doing things, different kinds of research. It's talk about humility. It's constantly humbling to see what my colleagues are doing when they're like, oh yeah, well we had 1 billion data points of telemetry and we brrr, and I'm like, wow, I interviewed 16 people, here's some insights. And they're like, wow, right? It goes both ways. It goes both ways. Career stage question, I would be very wary of advising anybody early in their career to eschew discipline. I think it's just really, really, if they want to go into industry, maybe it would work, but I do think that you need to reach a certain status level to be able to publish in places that aren't your primary places, go to conferences that aren't your primary conferences. I mean, in my own experience, after I had started the Association of Internet Researchers and was very well known internationally in internet studies, sitting in a communication department, my department chair was like, well, you're a rising star, but you need to publish in these journals, right? That was one of the reasons I left.
And,
Right,
and
so-
to come back to the discussion that we were having about the things that get in the way, that's clearly one of them. You know,
Absolutely.
it's a privilege right now to be
Absolutely.
an interdisciplinary scholar. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. That said, though, I think it would be, like, I think computer scientists should be taking ethics courses, for example, right? I think computer scientists should be taking sociology and communication courses. And I think that those people should be taking some intro to computer science at this stage as well. So I think that it's worth being educated in multiple disciplines, but I do think you have to earn your credit in your own discipline to be able, not intellectually, but disciplinarily to be successful if you haven't proven that. Government, 3 bullet points. Talk to Gina. I mean, I wish I had a good answer for you. I think that in general, the basic principle of what are their needs, you know, is really important to understand. You know, I think often, you probably know much more about this than I, right? But often folks go in with like, I have the solution, and there's so many things that they're not seeing that the politicians see. So awareness of where they are coming from, that meeting them where they are. There are some basic things like outside of the academy, nobody cares about your research methods. So skip that stuff, skip the lit review. Basically, you have to invert everything, right? All that stuff you would get to at the end, that's the headline. And if they ask questions, you can fill in the rest. I see neat Gina saying, yeah, Gina, I feel like you should talk later. I don't work a whole lot with government, so I'm not really well qualified to say. But I will say that in general, when dealing with anybody who's not academic, those seem to be the really key things.
Brilliant. And so now we are going to take 3 questions from online. And I think one of my colleagues from DGN is going to read them out.
I can summarise those. In fact, you answered Erica's question already, Nancy, without even knowing it.
Thanks, Erica.
So there's a question
Appreciate
here from
your question.
Nico. What discipline has methods that surprised you with how useful they were for other completely different disciplines or topics, is Nico's question. And there's a question from Quing asking, with the arrival of acclaimed PhD level AI, what impact might that have on researchers, especially in the interdisciplinary space? And how do you think that AI might facilitate or create barriers for collaboration?
The first question was methods. I think that people are much more open to qualitative methods than they're often given credit for. People really, even when they're extremely computational or mathematical, everybody loves stories. Stories bring things to life, and it takes a lot of education sometimes to get people to realize that stories from qualitative research are not anecdotes. But when you can get people to that place, and just as I had to go through a process of understanding what economists were after and developing respect for it, even though it seemed counter to my own instincts, I've seen our economists do the exact same, making their way to us, right? So an economist said to me, I used to think that everything you guys did was just telling stories, but now I've really come to respect your work, right? So there is a process, and but I think that I've been surprised how much people welcome qualitative analysis. I will say, though, that what I'm still waiting for is the moment when we figure out how telemetry and ethnography can kind of fit together to give us a better picture. Because right now they're in very different places, and there's all this incredible trace data from all these things people do. And we don't have really good methodological ways besides, okay, you do that part and I'll go do some participant observation and interviews. There's got to be a better way to merge these kinds of methodologies, and I don't think we are anywhere near there yet. That's my big methodological hope for interdisciplinarity. And the other question was about AI and...
whether it can facilitate or create barriers for interdisciplinary collaboration.
Yes.
You could say more.
What? I think it's a different beast. I think that it might, well, okay, so if I'm thinking to myself, I don't need a collaborator in that field anymore because I can use AI to, pretend you are a computer scientist. We are working together on a project, right? I can imagine the prompt. How do I have any way of assessing the accuracy of what it came out with? I don't, right? So I'm not sure that I want to, I'm not sure AI is at a point yet where we're ready to trust that it is an adequate stand-in for a person in another discipline. But I think even more than that, I guess I think that AI can really help us learn about other disciplines in ways that might speed the process. But I think that interdisciplinarity, like everything else, is about relationships and relationship building and trust, and that if AI becomes a substitute for a scholar in a different discipline, then we are holding ourselves back. And if it becomes an augmentation for working together across disciplines, then I think it could really get us places, right? I mean, I can imagine, for example, saying, I'm trying to explain this to a computer scientist and I'm having a lot of trouble. Can you help me articulate this idea in a way that that person might be able to understand? I can imagine sitting down with the AI output with that person and going, let's look at this, and getting to a place that was a lot better than we would have gotten to if I had just started by lecturing. So I can imagine ways in which it could be really, really helpful, but I will never say that I think it could be a substitute. And I don't think it would hinder. I think it would only hinder if people felt that it was a substitute for actually working with human beings in other disciplines.
Great. And can I ask a question? So there's something really interesting about the methodologies that you were talking about, and the idea that we might want to create new methodologies or merge or combine methodologies. And obviously AI itself is changing methodologies. So there's a really interesting dynamic that is iterative and happening with methodologies themselves, and AI itself is interacting with that. So there's quite a lot to think through there, not just in terms of AI itself as a site of study, but also the impact of AI in terms of the way we do research. I'd love to know your thoughts on that. I then have one last question before we close, but I'd love to know your thoughts on that question. Are you thinking about that at Microsoft Research?
I think about it. I've been thinking about it. I mean, yes. I don't think we're thinking about it in the sense of we've got a project where we're all focused on developing new methodologies. But for example, a few years ago when we all went work from home and people were trying to figure out what does this mean for organizations, I was approached by marketing. And they said, hey, we can land this piece in the Harvard Business Review, a place I never thought I would publish. They want us to contribute this piece. We're going to put you and Jonathan Larson together. And Jonathan Larson had enormous amounts of telemetry from Outlook and from Teams and from all of these things. And he was able to model, they had modeled that people were communicating with fewer people. They were communicating just as much, but the number of people with whom they were interacting got smaller when people went work from home. And then I came in as the, let me tell you about social capital and why bridging bonds are important person. And that was just such a nice taste of like what might happen if we could really get there. But in that case, I was bringing things I already knew to the study that Jonathan had already done. with others, right? And we weren't working together methodologically. But to me, it always feels like Microsoft is one of the few places where you really could have those kinds of breakthroughs because we have access to I mean, when I say we have access to the telemetry, it's not like I can find out what y'all are doing on Outlook, don't get me wrong. There's a huge amount of privacy measures in there. And it's very hard to actually get access to the telemetry from product groups. But that said, it does feel like the place where we have all these people and all this data, and maybe those breakthroughs could happen. We'll see if they do or not, but something we think about.
Absolutely, and I did wonder whether you had, I'm sure you've had internal conversations about that. One thing I wanted to, the final question really relates to this group of, researchers, organisations, networks, civil society. So we funded a wide range of international projects. A lot of these projects are about different types of knowledge that are not actually within the disciplines that we traditionally think about. So, they're forms of knowledge that relate to lived experience and engagement. I wanted to ask you about how to marry up thinking about interdisciplinarity with thinking about this question of whose knowledge, which is situated outside actually of the traditions and the confines of academia and seeks to move away from those traditions. Do you have any thoughts about how we might be able to marry some of those conversations up?
I mean, we've had a number of presentations today that rested on participatory engagement with communities that have a lot of lived experience and a lot of lived knowledge, and I think that's, I mean, if I'm a wool farmer, for example, I got some sheep, I'm concerned about the World Wide Web, I might not actually care at all about your academic disciplines, right? So why am I, you might be interested in my knowledge, but what's in it for me as a sheep farmer? Maybe nothing, maybe a cool robot dog. You had to be at the table. So I don't want to presume that every community that has knowledge wants to be part of interdisciplinary endeavors. Often I think we're trying to extract their knowledge from them for our interdisciplinary endeavors. So I guess the first thing I would say is this an exchange, or is this an exploitation and appropriation of knowledge that people don't really care about your stuff? If it is in fact an exchange, then I think that it has to be participatory, and there are lots of ways. I mean, I think some of the examples around indigeneity and the standards for what constitutes just work, just computing, are so important. So I think there are a lot of ways to bring in kinds of knowledge, but we do have to be able to, and I think a lot of, my colleague Emily Tseng, who's going to be at the University of Washington next year as a professor in their human-centered computing department, she has this really nice paper with some other folks from Cornell Tech where she did her PhD about participatory research in HCI, and they went through and they looked at a huge number of studies that had done participatory research. And what she found is that what almost always happens is that there's some sort of workshop where people brainstorm and they draw pictures and they write down ideas, and then the researchers take all of that stuff away and they do their thing, right? And maybe they iterate a little bit, but basically once the knowledge has been harvested from the people, they're set aside to go on with the project. And they're arguing in this paper that it has to be an ongoing relationship. You can't just have one workshop and be done. You got to be in it with them for the long haul. So I do think that, and that means, of course, that they're seeing the value, that they're gaining from it as well. And I don't think that that's a given, right? I think academics, we often think that because we're curious and we care about knowledge for knowledge's sake, that everybody else should too. And they're like, I got sheep to shear, man. I got some lambing to do.
Brilliant. We have one final question, and then we will close after that.
Hi, I'm Amy Johnson.
Your mic's not working, I don't think.
Okay.
Oh,
Try again.
Hello?
Yeah,
Okay,
there you
it's
go.
working.
I want the people online to hear you.
Hi, I'm Amy Johnson. I'm at the Global Data Barometer and Harvard Law School. Thank you for this great talk. So I had a two-part question. You can brush over one or drop one if you want for time. It was really about the practicalities of interdisciplinarity. And I wanted to invite you to reflect on your various experiences in terms of thinking about, does it matter how many disciplines are in the collaboration? Does it matter how distant those disciplines are in the collaboration, maybe in terms of methods or unit of analysis or research questions or knowledge sharing practices, as you mentioned earlier? And then also, finally, are there particular sort of constellations of interdisciplinary collaborations that you think we should be focusing on strengthening or pursuing for the digital good?
All right. Well, let me, I can't speak to some constellations being better than others. I think it's very hard to throw people from very different epistemological orientations into the same room and expect them to be able to collaborate effectively. But that said, within any particular discipline, you can still get a bunch of epistemological orientations. But to the question of what kinds of work do we need right now, I think that I am totally bought into the mission of my lab. I think the social sciences and the computational sciences need to be working together. And I don't think, especially at this point where AI is trained only on social data, right? AI is made of people. And you can't understand that without understanding the data on which it's working. And by the same token, understanding people doesn't get you to understanding AI. So if we're thinking about a digital good, and if we're assuming that AI is a component of that digital good, and even if we're not, but especially if we are, I think we really have to be working on the computational and the social sciences, learning one another's fields much better. And again, I don't think that I need to be able to write code to be able to work with computer scientists, but I think I need to know what an algorithm is. And I think they need to understand technology does not cause social effects. It's not cause and effect. It's not if we make this, then that will happen. They need to understand technologies always get used in ways that weren't anticipated, for example. They need to understand power. You know, it does matter so much. And there's zero training in how to think about power when you go out and you invent these systems that redistribute power radically. And often the people who are making these systems have no interest in redistributing power to the wealthy. They would like to create more equity, and they don't know how these systems might work against their own values. Yeah, I mean, the same is true of communication folks, right? Like, we laid out all of the details of how misinformation works, and the misinformers were like, yes, now we know what to do. So it goes both ways.
Thank you so much. It feels like it always comes back to power, and obviously we've got some conversations tomorrow as well. I wanted to thank you so much, Nancy, for a lovely discussion. I think it's been really rich and fruitful, and I really hope you enjoyed it as well. I certainly did, and on behalf of everyone, thank you so much. Thank you to you all. It's a big round of applause.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks to our audience online as well. All right. And I'm asked to invite you all to join our mailing list to stay up to date with upcoming events and other opportunities. Thank you. See you all. Bye.
What's the line? Bye. Thank you, Zooms.